What's up guys, I'm here with the hand-to-note software and the free Tie Fighter HUD, which you can get from www.pokerdeathstar.xyz. We're going to be using the Tie Fighter to run some very basic analysis on this particular hero. We're going to run through what the stats on the main panel are, and also what we'd expect to see in terms of values for those stats. So we can launch the main pop-up simply by double-clicking on the hero alias from the main hand-to-note window. Let's work through each of these stats one by one. Now the good news with the Tie Fighter HUD is all of the stats are named, so you can see instantly which stats are available. The stats in the Tie Fighter pop-up are identical to the stats on the main HUD panel for the Tie Fighter and all of the other HUD profiles. That's the Tidarium Shuttle, the Star Destroyer, and the Death Star. This is what the main panel of those HUDs looks like, apart from it doesn't have the written description, it just has the stats themselves. So in a sense, the Tie Fighter pop-up serves as good training for using one of the bigger HUD profiles further down the line. So let's start off with perhaps our two most important values. We have the VPIP, voluntarily put in pot, and the PFR stat. So VPIP obviously shows us what percentage of the time a player voluntarily invests chips into the pot, and PFR shows us what percentage of the time this player decides to take an aggressive action pre-flop when given the opportunity. For a good winning reg, VPIP's usually going to be around 25 and PFR is going to be around 20. There are lots of variations on this. So we see, for example, this particular player is playing 28-19. So we're seeing a VPIP PFR gap of 9% in this case, which is quite large. Now in some cases this is acceptable. For example, this is a common side effect of using a small blind complete strategy. That is, when we're first acting the small blind, we simply limp or complete rather than open raise. And this is a strategy that many professional players use. While we typically don't open limp from any other position, the small blind is considered the exception. Now what having a small blind completing strategy does is it drives up our VPIP, but our PFR stays the same in many cases, so it increases that VPIP PFR gap. Now that can be an acceptable reason why we have a large gap between VPIP and PFR, but there are lots of unacceptable reasons as well. For example, this might just be a player who cold calls too much. So if you have a look at your particular Tie Fighter panel and you see that there is a big gap between VPIP and PFR, the first question is, what causes that? Is it caused by an aggressive small blind completing strategy, or is it caused by an overly high cold call stat? Now in this case, we see that this hero is cold calling 18% of the time. So the next question is, what should that be? Well, a typical winning 6-max reg is going to have a cold call around 12 or 13%. So we see that there is going to be a big issue here with cold calling strategy. This player is definitely cold calling too wide in some spots. If you wanted to run some advanced analysis, our next step would be to go in and check positionally what the cold call stats look like and try and find out why this cold call stat is so high. But in this case, we can say that the VPIP PFR gap is actually caused by a bad cold calling strategy, not by a small blind completing strategy. That's not to say this player never completes in the small blind, perhaps he does. Now you might notice straight away that the open limp stat is 0. Remember, this applies to open limp. It doesn't necessarily include small blind completes. So this player doesn't open limp from any other position, which is great. That's good news. In fact, if you have anything other than 0 for open limp, you're probably making some mistakes pre-flop. That should be 0 for a good winning reg. So we don't know whether this player completes in the small blind, but we do know the cold call is way too high. So have a look at these stats for yourself. Your cold call should be around 12%. Moving on to some of the other important pre-flop stats, we have a 3-bet pre-flop in the top right, 5.6%. What should that be for a good winning 6-max reg? Usually around 7 or 8%. So we can see that this particular hero is on the passive side. Once again, if we're going to run some more advanced analysis, we'd have a look positionally. What do the 3-bet frequencies look like from every spot? Where can we find an opportunity to increase this 3-bet aggression? As a starting tip, usually big blind versus small blind and button versus cutoff are excellent starting points for trying to increase our 3-bet aggression. So this player needs to 3-bet a bit more. Let's have a look at fold versus 3-bet. We see 54% for that stat. What do we expect to see here? Well, theoretically, this value should be, let's say, around 50% if we were to analyze this through a GTO style lens. But in most cases, we don't care about that. Our objective here is to play exploitatively. We want to figure out what our opponents are doing wrong and how we can exploit that. Now, one of the mistakes that most players make is that they don't 3-bet enough. Now, it's true that sometimes we'll get guys who 3-bet a lot. They might 3-bet more than we should. But if we take the population as a whole, the average opponent doesn't 3-bet quite as much as they're supposed to. In fact, Hero's values are quite typical on this front. We see 5.6% 3-bet, but we're saying that it should really be 7 or 8%. Now, this is what a lot of our opponents are going to be like. They should be 3-betting 8%, but they're really 3-betting 5%. So how do we exploit an opponent who's not 3-betting as aggressively as they're supposed to? Very simply, we don't play back as much against their 3-bets. We actually want to fold slightly more as an exploit. It might feel weak to fold a lot against 3-bets, but really we're the one exploiting our opponents if we do this, because when they 3-bet aces or kings or ace-king, we're not giving them action as often in those scenarios. So as a result, we'd expect exploitatively fold to 3-bet could be as high as 60%. So it's possible that this play is actually paying out slightly too wide against 3-bets with a fold to 3-bet stat of 54%. Now, it's very important not to interpret these stats too much in a vacuum. For example, if someone was to open raise extremely tight, it makes sense not going to fold as much to 3-bets. Whereas if a player were to open raise very aggressively, they are in many cases going to have a higher fold to 3-bet stat. Or in some cases perhaps not, perhaps they just call a lot of 3-bets. But the idea is we can't look at this stat in a vacuum. We have to think about it in the context of how wide this play is open raising to begin with. So this brings us to our attempt to still stat, which you can see in yellow in the middle at the top, 41. So what should this be? Should be around 40%. Now, if you're wondering about the attempt to still stat, it's an average of the open raise frequencies across small blind, button, and cutoff positions, and it should usually aggregate to around 40%. If you have a look at your ATS value, and you see that it's more like 35%, 30%, what this means is we're not stealing as aggressively as we should be from small blind, button, and cutoff. It could be one of those positions more than the others, or it could be equally, we're just not open raising enough from these positions. In most cases, this is caused by lack of button RFI aggression and lack of small blind RFI aggression. The cutoff is usually less of an issue because we don't play that aggressively from the cutoff. Just to give you some numbers, a good cutoff raise first in frequency is usually around 27%, whereas a good button raise first in frequency is close to 50%, and a good small blind raise first in frequency is at least 36%, but it's very often more like 40% plus. So as you can see, both button and small blind should be a lot higher than cutoff, and they very often have a bigger impact on the ATS stat if the ATS stat is too low, for example. On the flip side, if you see your ATS is like 50-60%, you might be overdoing it in common still scenarios. Now let's have a look at fold versus 4-bet and 4-bet range. Fold versus 4-bet, what should it be? Well, it shouldn't be 37%. Now back on the idea of exploiting our opponent's weaknesses, another thing that the population doesn't do very much is they don't 4-bet anywhere near as much as they're supposed to. To put that into context, the average good player should have a 4-bet range of around 4 or 5%, but the average player has a 4-bet range more like 2 or 3%. In fact, once again, you can see Hero's values are quite typical here. Hero has a 4-bet range of 3.2%, but as we said, it should be 4 or 5%. This is very typical of the types of opponents we're going to face. When they 4-bet against us, it means trouble because they're not 4-betting as aggressively as they should be. So what's the obvious counter strategy against an opponent who is not 4-betting as aggressively as they should be? Well, we should be folding a lot more. As a rough guide, an exploitative fold versus 4-bet value should very likely be around 60%. Now, it probably doesn't want to be too much higher than that. If we start folding 70 or 80% of the time to 4-bets, might eventually end up with a target on our back if our opponents are collating data on us. But generally speaking, 60% is fine, and if it's 37, there's a good chance if we ran some analysis, if we ran some further filters on Hero's game, we'd see that he's simply paying out too wide when facing 4-bets. Now we have these stats in the top left. We have fold big blind versus small blind still, and fold blinds versus button still. Mostly I use these stats for opponent analysis, so I'm not too worried about these stats for hero. Generally these give us a rough idea whether our opponent's defending enough. We've already kind of gone through that by looking at the 3-bet stats and the cold call stats. In terms of how we can use these stats for our opponents, if our opponent has a fold big blind versus small blind still stat above 60%, we can open raise any 2 cards in the small blind. If we have a look at those fold blinds versus button steal, have a look at those stats for both of our opponents. If we add them together and the total of those stats is 150 or more, we can open raise any 2 cards from the button and generate automatic profit. So for example, we are on the button, we have a look at small blind, fold blind versus button steal, 70%. Look at big blind is 80, add those together, 150. We can open raise any 2 cards in that spot. Now there's a reason why these stats are on the main panel. So a common issue I see with players is every time they get to the small blind situation where it's folded around to them, of course you want to know how often is our opponent folding to small blind open raises. So what do they have to do? Sometimes they have to bring up a pop-up from somewhere. So that means every single time they're in a small blind unopened scenario, they have to click and bring up a pop-up. Now if you think about that across hundreds of thousands of hands, that's a lot of extra energy that we don't really want to expend. That's why any stat we're using on a regular basis should be on our main panel. It's a very specific reason why fold big blind versus small blind steal stat is on this main panel, and the same goes for the other stats on this panel. They are carefully selected to be some of the higher frequency spots which we need to check consistently throughout the course of a session, and if these stats weren't here on the main panel, then it means we'd have to be clicking a pop-up a lot of the time. Now, of course, as we've mentioned, in the case of the Tie Fighter, this is the pop-up. But as we've mentioned, it's got exactly the same layout as the main HUD panel for the Tie Fighter and all of the other cash game HUD profiles available at pokerdeathstar.xyz. So essentially what we're looking at is the main panel right now, apart from we have the descriptions of all of the different stats. That's all of the pre-flop stuff, so let's move on now to post-flop stats. Most important post-flop stats are typically going to be the c-bet values, especially c-bet flop in position. That is the highest frequency post-flop spot. So if we're playing badly in a c-bet flop in position scenario, it's going to have a much bigger impact on our win rate. Let's say, for example, we are messing up river c-bets. Well, that's still a leak, we want to fix that, but it's not going to be anywhere near as impactful on our win rate when we compare it with a high frequency spot such as c-bet flop in position. That's why we say c-bet flop in position. It's very important that we get this right. So you can see here it has 51% c-bet flop in position. What should that be? Well, the problem here is that we're on the passive side. As a rough guide, good winning 6 max reg should have around 65% c-bet flop in position. If it was going to be any different from that, we'd prefer it to be even slightly higher potentially. We don't like to see values between 50 and 60 because they're on the passive side. It means we're missing out on some very good continuation bet opportunities. Now if we contrast that to c-bet flop out of position, we see that this particular hero is c-betting 63% of the time, which means that he's actually c-betting more aggressively out of position than he is in position. Now, on a very basic, fundamental level, that's not something we want to be doing. Being in position is more profitable. That allows us to c-bet a wider range profitably. And that's what we want to do. We want to c-bet more aggressively in position and less aggressively out of position. As a rough guide for c-bet flop OOP, we're expecting to see values somewhere between the 20 and 50% region. And there are certain players out there who like to check their entire range out of position, but in reality, if we want to maximize our profits here, we do want some kind of c-bet range. That's why we say somewhere between 20 and 50% is an acceptable range here, but usually round about 35% is what we're aiming for c-bet flop out of position. So we can see for this particular player, the numbers are a little bit inverted here. That c-bet flop out of position value of 63, that's what we should have for in position. And out of position wants to be around 35% as we discussed. So have a look at your values. Most important value here is c-bet flop in position. We're expecting to see 65%. If it's not, you might want to ask yourself why, and that can be one of the areas for you to work on. In terms of barreling stats, Now, we'll approximate the turn c-bet stat here by just saying that in position c-bet and out of position c-bet are going to be roughly similar. I usually cite 52% as the target value for c-bet turn in position and out of position. So we can see here for this particular hero, we just have a complete lack of barreling aggression. C-bet turn in position is 38%, C-bet turn out of position is 35%. That could be caused by a whole host of different reasons. It could be that this player is not barreling his draws aggressively enough. It could be that he's slow playing rather than going for value. It could be that he's missing protection bets on the turn. That's something that we can find the answer to by doing some further digging, doing some more advanced database analysis on the spot. But on the surface value, we see that this player is just not c-betting the turn as aggressively as he should be. C-bet river. It's generally important that we do differentiate between c-bet river in position and out of position, at the very least for exploitative reasons. And that's because generally, when we c-bet the river in position, our opponents fold quite a bit more compared to when we c-bet the river out of position. Our in position opponent doesn't fold as much when he's in position. The reasons aren't necessarily important. It's something that we can learn by running range research with hand to know. But in terms of the way we respond, now that is important. And what it means is we're not going to be bluffing anywhere near as aggressively out of position when we triple barrel. I usually find that a well-formed c-bet river in position strategy is going to be around 44%, whereas c-bet river out of position should be a lot lower, probably somewhere in the 30 to 35% region. Now we see this particular player has numbers well above that. He has c-bet river in position 56 and c-bet river out of position 43. Does that mean that he's definitely triple barreling too much? Not necessarily. Remember what we said earlier about the importance of taking stat values within the appropriate context of other stats. Remember, this particular player is just not barreling the turn very much. He may be getting to the river with a much stronger range than he should be, so it makes sense that his c-bet river stats are going to be higher compared to a player who is barreling the turn a lot more aggressively and ending up on the river with a larger amount of air hands. So it's important to keep that in mind. The way I'll usually work with such players is I'll say, well, let's fix the c-bet flop issues first, then let's see what happens to the turn and river frequencies afterwards. Then we can work on those when we are interpreting them in a slightly more normalized context. Whereas right now it's very difficult to know what that c-bet river in position 56% means, because clearly the flop and turn c-betting strategy are highly unorthodox at this stage and need seeing to first. Moving on now to fold to c-bet stats in position and out of position. Now hopefully it doesn't come as a big surprise that we should be folding slightly more often to c-bets and barrels when we're out of position. Let's start with in position. As a rough guide, I recommend folding the flop just above 40% when in position, so around 41, 42. Fold to turn should be around 40%. Fold to river c-bet should be somewhere between 50 and 60%. Can sometimes even be a shade above 60%. Now, if you're doing some advanced work with things like solvers, you might look at that and think, well, if you fold 65% to a triple barrel, that's too much. And that's correct in some contexts, but remember, we're trying to play exploitatively here. And one thing the population doesn't do very much is they don't triple barrel bluff very much. Average player, when they triple barrel, they're going to be heavily weighted towards value. So it doesn't really incentivize a lot of bluff catching on the part of the defender. So that's why fold to river c-bet stats should usually be quite high. 60% is completely fine for fold to river c-bet in position. Fold to c-bet out of position are going to be similar, just slightly higher. Fold to flop c-bet OP should probably be around 48%. Fold to turn will still be around 40%, maybe a shade above, 41, 42, etc. We have to fold slightly more of our draws out of position when facing a double barrel, whereas in position we can call slightly more of our draws. Have this great opportunity where if we call in position, facing a double barrel, and our opponent checks the river, we can stab the river and usually pick up the pot, whereas out of position doesn't really work so well. So we're going to fold slightly more often OP, then once again, fold to river triple barrel is going to be high, it's going to be around 60%. Now looking at these players defend against c-bet stats, the frequencies don't seem completely out of line. They seem a little bit off. For example, it seems like we're maybe defending slightly too much against flop c-bets. Maybe we're folding slightly too much to the river c-bet when out of position. But in general, I would say this particular part of Hero's game is a lot less bad than the part of his game where he's playing as the aggressor. Ironically, playing as the aggressor is much more important, so it's actually the more important part of Hero's game that needs the most work. That's going to contribute the most to win rate. Moving on to some of the other flop stats. If you have a look there on the second line, we have in bright green, raise versus flop c-bet. Now this is an aggregate of in-position raise against c-bet and out-of-position raise against c-bet. So one thing, if you wanted to go a bit more advanced with this, you could break that down into in-position and out-of-position. What should that average stat be? I would guess somewhere around the 12% frequency. In other words, one area of the game that this particular player could work on, finding more situations to raise against flop c-bets. We have room to do that more aggressively than is being done currently. If you look at those dark green stats next to it, we have fold flop c-bet versus raise, and fold turn c-bet versus raise. Fold flop c-bet versus raise, once again, this is a spot where the population doesn't raise as aggressively as they should be. Once again, Hero's value is quite typical. Population is supposed to be raising 12%, but are actually only raising 6 or 7%. So how do we exploit that? We exploit that by giving a lot of credit to flop raises and also by extension giving a lot of credit to turn raises. That means our folding frequencies when facing these types of raises should be quite high. As a rough guide, we should be folding around 55% of the time when we c-bet the flop and get raised. And we should likely be folding even more on the turn, perhaps 60 or even 65% of the time when our turn c-bet gets raised. And remember, these are exploitative values. If you look at the GTO version of things, we're not necessarily supposed to fold that much when facing a turn raise, but certainly as an exploit, it's completely fine to fold something like 60-65% of the time when facing a raise. Of course, if we see specific opponents are trying to exploit us for that, it doesn't happen as often as you might think. But if it did happen, we'd obviously start folding less when our turn c-bets get raised. Okay, moving on. Open limp, we should ideally have 0 for that, as discussed. Fold to flop donk. This is usually going to be around 42% or so, very similar to fold to c-bet in position stat. It's a very similar spot, and we're probably playing against a recreational player because it's usually recreational players that donk bet the flop. And that's why in our case, for most of you, you'd probably expect to see a donk flop value of 0. It's just not something that's very important. Technically, at a very high level, there are some flops that are supposed to be donk bet, but once again, it's really not as many as you might think. The cold caller is supposed to spend most of their time checking to the pre-flop aggressor. So now moving on to the bottom two lines. So firstly, we have c-bet in 3-bet pots. We have c-bet flop in position and c-bet flop out of position in 3-bet pots. So c-bet flop in position should be very high, even higher than it is in single raised heads-up pots. Should be around 75. C-bet flop out of position, that should be more like 60%. So it is going to be more aggressive than single raised heads-up pots, but it shouldn't be 80%. So you can see once again, this particular hero seems to have their numbers inverted. We have an overly low c-bet flop in position in 3-bet pots, and we have an overly high c-bet flop out of position in 3-bet pots. We then have fold to flop c-bet in 3-bet pots. So these values are going to be somewhere around 45% fold to c-bet, quite similar to single raised heads-up pots. Now, although we often get a better price facing a continuation bet in 3-bet pots because our opponents generally use smaller c-bet sizings, they also usually have a stronger range after they 3-bet pre-flop. So these numbers often end up being quite similar to single raised heads-up pots, and in some cases they might even be slightly higher. So we have 38 and 43 for heroes values. They might be slightly on the low side here. We might be paying out slightly too wide against c-bets, but it really does depend on heroes pre-flop calling range. It also depends on how often the population is using half-pot c-bet sizings compared to 1/3 c-bet sizings, etc. Now let's have a look at these stats in bright yellow over at the bottom right. So we have float bet flop. This stands for bet versus miss c-bet in position. This is a spot where the player pool folds too much, and as a result, we want to bluff here quite aggressively. Usually good players are going to have a much higher float bet flop. It's going to be around 70% or so. Float, flop, and fold. How often do we fold to the check raise after float betting the flop? That should usually be a little bit higher than 43%. It's probably going to be around 55, 60, maybe even slightly higher for playing very aggressively with flop float bets. So remember, it's another spot where population's really not bluffing very much, and the way we exploit that is just by folding a lot when our float bet gets check raised. Float bet on the turn, so that's bet versus miss c-bet in position on the turn. That should also be very high because the population is also folding way too much when facing a turn float bet. 38% is very passive, we'd expect to see around 70% here. Pro bet turn, that's bet versus missed c-bet out of position. So pretty much the same as float bet, but now we're talking about an out of position scenario. So the in position open raiser decided to check back the flop rather than c-bet, then we fire the turn. That's a turn pro bet. Another great spot to be very aggressive. We don't want to see 44% probe turn. Generally, if we're playing very well exploitatively, this is going to be more like 70%. But of course, the GTO values for these stats are lower. Even for something like float bet flop, the GTO value is more like 45, 50%. Whereas exploitative value is more like 70%. So we really want two value sets in our mind. We want the GTO theory value for reference, but the important thing here is exploitative values. That's what we're discussing right now, and that's why our turn pro bet stat should be more like 70% rather than 44%. Same for delayed c-bet. You want to play very aggressively in this spot. This is probably the most profitable automatic profit situation. We want to have delayed c-bet frequency of above 70%, maybe even 75 or 80%. Especially in position delayed c-bet, that can be as high as 85%. The average is probably going to be somewhere around 75, 80% for this delayed c-bet stat. So when we see this player has 47% delayed c-bet, it means he's missing out on a very large amount of bluff opportunities. Over on the bottom left-hand side of the grid, we have fold to probe. That should usually be around 50%. Check fold versus flop float. That should be around 50%. Check fold versus turn float. That's usually going to be more like 55, 60%. We'll see something strange is going on when hero has 39% check fold versus turn float. This is when you can start to see patterns and generate theories regarding what's going on. Remember, this particular player just didn't seem to c-bet the turn very much out of position. Remember that? He has 35% c-bet turn out of position. Why is his turn c-bet out of position so low? Perhaps he likes to trap a lot in this spot. Perhaps he c-bets the flop with his monsters, and then he just loves to set a trap on the turn. He checks a lot, so that when villain float bets a turn, he can go for a check raise or a check call. Either way, it's suspicious that his check fold versus turn float is only 39%, when the average player is folding way too much against turn float bets. Average player is folding 60% or so when facing a turn float bet. So it's really suspicious that this player has 39% fold versus turn float bet. Combined with the fact that he doesn't c-bet turn very much, OP, begin to see a pattern forming here. Fold versus delayed c-bet. Players I work with usually play in a very specific way in this scenario. And without going into details, the result is fold versus delayed c-bet is going to be very low. It's going to be something like 10 or 15% fold versus delayed c-bet. So 52%, that's fairly typical. It's not necessarily a leak. It might be slightly even closer to game theory optimal play or something like that. But certainly the way that I recommend playing this game, that fold versus delayed c-bet stat should be very low, probably in the 15% region. Alright, that's all the stats on the Tie Fighter HUD. Hopefully you have pretty good rough idea of how you can take this pop-up panel from the Tie Fighter and use it to get a rough idea about where the leaks are in your current game. Remember, this is available completely for free. All you have to do is create an account at pokerdeathstar.xyz. You can grab this particular HUD for free, you can install it for free. You don't need a hand-to-note subscription. I'm running this on a hand-to-note account which I haven't registered a key with, just to prove the concept. All these stats are completely unlocked, so you don't need to make a payment for the HUD. You don't need to make a payment to hand-to-note. You can get hand-to-note for free. You can get this HUD for free. All you have to do is create an account at pokerdeathstar.xyz and go and download the Tie Fighter HUD. The other advantage to having unlocked stats like this is you can take these as a base collection of stats and use them to build your own HUD or your own pop-ups. So what you can do is you can take something like c-bet flop and you can modify it. You can clone it and you can modify it to make another stat. For example, if you have c-bet flop, With a small modification, we could turn that into c-bet flop on ace-high texture, or c-bet flop for 1/3 sizing, or even skip c-bet. So we can use these as a basis for using the hand-to-note clone and mass clone features to make our own custom HUD profiles and custom pop-up profiles. Alright, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to get the Tie Fighter, head on over to www.pokerdeathstar.xyz and create an account. Thanks very much, guys. Good luck at the tables.